Avinu Shabashamayim, Barech et Medinat Yisrael. Loving God in heaven, bless, we pray, the state of Israel. All of us, I know, are deeply concerned about the fate of the ceasefire and hostage release on which so many lives are depending. We want no more bloodshed of innocent Palestinians, no more deaths of Israeli soldiers, and after nearly 500 days, we want Israel's hostages home. When we witnessed the condition of the three released last Shabbat, we were reminded once again of the evil of the enemy Israel has been facing. And when early this week Hamas declared a halt to the hostage for prisoner exchanges, we shuddered. Now it appears that Hamas will adhere to the existing agreement, but so much remains uncertain with an enemy who cannot be trusted, a prime minister with a complicated political agenda, and a new American president with his own unconventional approach. I can't imagine anyone better equipped to help us make sense of it all than tonight's most distinguished guest. Today, Ambassador Stuart Eizenstat is senior counsel in Covington and Burling's international practice. His work focuses on resolving international trade problems and business disputes with the U.S. and foreign governments, and international business transactions and regulations on behalf of U.S. companies and others around the world. So I'm sure his plate is full already, or will be soon. And of course, during a lifetime of public service in 6 U.S. administrations, Ambassador Eizenstat held such key positions as Chief White House Domestic Policy Advisor to President Jimmy Carter and U.S. Ambassador to the European Union, Undersecretary of Commerce for International Trade, Undersecretary of State for Economic Business and Agricultural Affairs, and Deputy Secretary of the Treasury under President Clinton. During the Obama administration, he served on the Defense Policy Board. In the Carter White House, he was a major figure in every domestic legislative achievement. He also recommended to President Carter a presidential commission on the Holocaust, which led to congressional approval for the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Under President Clinton, he served as special representative of the President and Secretary of State on Holocaust-era issues, negotiating major agreements with Europe covering restitution of property, payment for slave and forced laborers, and recovery of looted art, bank accounts, and payment of insurance policies. He also served as State Department Special Advisor on Holocaust-era issues under President Obama, negotiating additional important agreements, and as well during the first Trump and then Biden administrations. And he was appointed by President Biden as chairman of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum Council. Ambassador Eizenstat has received more than 80 awards, including 8 honorary doctorates. He's been awarded highest civilian honors from the governments of France, Germany, Austria, Israel, Belgium, and Lithuania, as well as from Secretary of State Warren Christopher, Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, and Secretary of the Treasury Lawrence Summers. The author of books and articles beyond count. It is his volumes, The Art of Diplomacy, recently published, and President Carter, The White House Years, that we turn to tonight. Few advisors were as close to President Carter as Ambassador Eizenstat, which is why he was sought out by every media outlet after President Carter's passing, and why he delivered one of the eulogies at the President's memorial service at the National Cathedral. From his first days in office, President Carter made Middle East peace a priority, culminating in the historic 1978 Camp David Accords between Israel and Egypt. Tonight, Ambassador Eizenstat shares an insider's perspective on Carter's philosophy of peacemaking, his triumphs and failures in dealing with the Middle East, and the lessons they offer for this incredibly trying moment. His theme tonight, Lessons from President Carter for Today's Challenges in the Middle East. With thanks to our Stryker Cultural Center and its director, Dr. Gadi Levy, it is a pleasure to welcome to the pulpit Ambassador Stuart E. Eizenstat.
Shabbat Shalom. Thank you very much. It's an honor to be asked by your esteemed Rabbi Josh Davidson, who we actually worked together on a Muslim-Jewish reconciliation council many years ago. And I am speaking to you in one of the most renowned congregations of this country. I also want to thank Dr. Gadi Levy, who has made such effort to get me here. And if I may just take a personal aside to recognize a few people in this magnificent congregation who are very special to me, my son Brian and daughter-in-law Erin, their children Julia, Caroline and Aaron, and Eric, and my editor Paul Golub, who's edited all of my books, and a very special friend, Patty Kenner, who is a champion of every good thing there is in New York City, and my publicist, Marion Brown. In over 70 years since Israel's 1948 War of Independence, there have only been 3 major peace agreements involving Israel and its Arab neighbors. Each was made possible because of the direct involvement of the United States. The first was 1978, the Camp David Accords, and then 1979, the treaty between Egypt and Israel, in which I was directly involved. I was the back channel to the Israeli embassy. And it took the courage of President Carter to take political risks in pushing all sides, including Israel, to make painful compromises. The second was in 1994, the agreement in the Clinton administration in which I served with Jordan and King Hussein. And the third, more recently, 2020, the Abraham Accords under the Trump administration with the United Arab Emirates, Morocco, Sudan, and Bahrain. Let me start at the beginning. In April of 1977, at the Blair House in Washington across from the White House, a young Jerusalem Post reporter named Wolf Blitzer, later of CNN fame, suggested to Egyptian President Sadat that he should consider exchange visits between Israeli journalists and students. 7 months later, Sadat went one step further than Wolf even suggested, shocking the Egyptian parliament and the world by saying he was willing to go to Jerusalem to make peace. Peace with a country with whom Egypt had fought 4 wars as its most powerful enemy. This prompted an immediate invitation from Prime Minister Begin, and on a momentous day, and we should capture it now because we're in such a turmoil about what's happening in Israel today, to capture the grandeur of that moment, November 19th, 1977. It was a Saturday night, just after Shabbat had concluded, when a glistening white jet emblazoned with the emblem Arab Republic of Egypt came out of the dark sky like a biblical miracle. And it landed in Jerusalem to a warm welcome by an Israeli military band that did not have the notes to their national anthem and had to listen to the radio to try to figure how to play it. That's how much of a surprise this all was. Sadat was warmly received by President Begin, and in the receiving line were Israeli leaders and generals with whom Sadat had gone to war. Many literally had tears in their eyes, never believing this day would come. Golda Meir was one of those in that line. She had been the Israeli leader when Sadat launched the surprise attack on Yom Kippur in 1973 that literally threatened Israel's existence. He walked in the receiving line and said to Golda, "Golda, shalom. I've waited to meet you for a long time." She replied, "I've waited to meet you a long time." And he kissed her on the cheek. When he got to Ariel Sharon, the general with whom he had fought in the Egyptian desert, later prime minister, they joked about who had chased whom the most. His message to the Knesset and to the Israeli public was very simple and very compelling, and so necessary today. No more wars, no more bloodshed, no more threats, he said. It took a unique political courage for which Sadat paid a real price. His foreign minister resigned in protest. He became a pariah in the Arab world. And the Arab League threw out Egypt from their membership and left Cairo as its headquarters. And a couple of years later, after the treaty, he was assassinated. But Sadat was undaunted. And yet, he became embittered after his bold visit because he felt that Prime Minister Begin had not quickly enough reacted and reciprocated to his request that all Israeli settlements in the Egyptian Sinai be removed and all settlers leave. In return for full diplomatic relations and an end of all hostilities. There were months of fruitless bilateral negotiations between Egypt and Israel. Indeed, in February of '78, President Carter had to convince Sadat not to totally withdraw from the talks. Now showing his own political courage, against the advice, and I can assure you it was against the advice of all of his advisors, he invited Begin and Sadat and their top aides to a summit meeting at the beautiful, secluded presidential retreat at Camp David. We were all convinced that this would be a massive failure that would stain his reputation. But he believed so strongly in striving for peace in the Middle East, in the Holy Land to him, that he overrode all of our objections. Indeed, as we look back, perhaps the only argument that remains is that during their 77 years of marriage, Jimmy and Rosalind each thought the other had actually come up with the idea of using Camp David. He was determined not to let Sadat's bold and courageous move slip away. In my opinion, the Camp David Accords, which resulted, were the greatest act of personal presidential diplomacy in American history. Carter tried first to create a personal atmosphere of trust with both sides and between them. He dressed casually, he barred the press to avoid leaks and each leader playing to their home audiences. And then he struck on the idea of bringing Begin and Sadat in his presidential limousine to the nearby Gettysburg battlefield to show them by example the futility of any more wars. Sadat had been a general. He studied the Battle of Gettysburg, and to Carter's slight embarrassment as a Southerner, recounted all the mistakes the Confederates had made in losing the battle. Begin, for his part, was so moved that extemporaneously and without a note, he flawlessly delivered President Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. Carter also tried to create a personal atmosphere by creating the first and only kosher Shabbat dinner at Camp David, through which he sat in its entirety. But the relationship between Sadat and Begin was poisonous, and putting them together was like putting two scorpions in a bottle. Indeed, the one time right after they came for their first meeting, the animosities broke out so fiercely that Carter, for the rest of the 13 days and nights, never put them together again until the night of the final agreement. Begin was difficult as a negotiating partner. He had been elected after 6 election defeats in the past in 1977 as the first Likud prime minister after 30 years of labor governments. He had a philosophy based on Jabotinsky that Israel had a mandate from God to control all the territory between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River, an ironic mirror image of today's Palestinian demands from the river to the sea. So President Carter went to Begin's more flexible leaders. Foreign Minister Moshe Dayan, the hero of the 1967 Six-Day War with his eye patch and all, Defense Minister Ezer Weitzman, and most crucially, legal advisor and later Supreme Court Justice Aharon Barak. He personally drafted 22 separate peace agreements, shuttling between the Israeli cabins and the Egyptian cabins, with virtually no sleep. On the 13th and last day, the parties were close, but not there. And Begin went to President Carter's cabin, thanked him for his enormous efforts, but said, "Mr. President, I cannot and I will not make any more compromises. Get me a White House limousine. I have an El Al plane waiting to take me home at Andrews Air Force Base." Realizing that if Sadat came back after his courageous trip to Jerusalem empty-handed, he might be killed on the spot, or certainly his government would fall, and he himself would be the object of enormous criticism. Because of his extraordinary preparation, he remembered in reading the CIA profiles of Menachem Begin that he had a particular soft spot for his 8 grandchildren. And so the president asked his secretary, Susan Clow, to get their names and then to make 8 copies of the initial photograph of the 3 of them on day 1 when they came into Camp David, and then personally autographed each to a grandchild with hopes for peace, Jimmy Carter. He then walked over to Begin's cabin and handed him the 8 photographs. He saw Begin look at each, vocalize the names of each of his grandchildren, saw tears well up in Begin's eyes and his lips quiver. He put down his bags and he said, "Mr. President, for my grandchildren, I'll make one last try," and that one last try sealed the deal. Sadat had insisted not only in getting all the Egyptian Sinai back and all the Israelis out of the Sinai, but that there had to be something for the Palestinians for him to take home to the Arab world. And so, out of the blue, Carter came up with a vague formulation that the Palestinians should have, quote unquote, full autonomy, which would be negotiated in more detail over the next 5 years. This was an effort to give Sadat some coverage. The Palestinians were not present at Camp David, not one, because the Arab League had designated the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, headed by Yasser Arafat, to represent the Palestinians instead of King Hussein of Jordan, a fatal mistake. And Arafat refused to accept the basic formula of the United Nations Resolution 242 of land for peace, which was a legal requirement by Congress for any participation by an American president with them. So they weren't present at all. Camp David was a framework for peace, not a legally binding treaty. And it called for converting this framework into a binding treaty within 3 months. Well, 3 months went by, 4 months, 5 months, 6 months, no treaty. And here again, and I can assure you I'm not exaggerating, over the objection of every one of his advisors, he decided to go to the region and try to convert the Camp David Accords into a treaty. He simply said to us, I've gone this far. If I fail, at least I'll have done everything possible. He then shuttled for 3 days between Egypt and Israel, met with the entire Israeli cabinet at 3 o'clock in the morning one night. Again, they were close, but not there. And so on a Sunday, Air Force One was refueled at Ben Gurion Airport. The airspace was cleared. All of his senior aides made the way down from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv, leaving only a few of us there. And Begin suddenly called in the morning and said he wanted to see President Carter again. And we all thought, well, he's just saying, thanks for coming, I'm sorry it didn't work. Begin was very formal, so President Carter, who was in his flight outfit, quickly put his coat and tie on, told us to entertain Begin, and Begin said, now, young men, you know, you're in the King David Hotel, and this is a famous hotel, but not for the reasons you think. When I was head of the underground Irgun during the British Mandate, I blew this hotel up. Don't worry, I won't do it until President Carter leaves. Begin went up to the presidential suite at the King David, and that's where the final treaty was reached. And when the two leaders came down on the elevator of the famous King David Hotel to a waiting press to announce this breakthrough, historic breakthrough, the elevator broke between the first floor and the lobby. It took the Secret Service to take Begin and Carter out butt first, and I call it the breech birth of the treaty. In the end, Begin was also politically courageous because much of his own Likud party objected to the Egyptian treaty, and he himself had to give up his own personal dream of retiring in the Sinai. That treaty made it easier years later, in 1994, for King Hussein of Jordan, a country half of whose population was made up of Palestinians, to courageously sign a peace treaty with Israel. And then a quarter of a century later, in 2020, the courageous Mohammed bin Zayed, the Crown Prince of the United Arab Emirates, with no public support, decided to normalize relations without ever having the UAE and Israel in the same room. They never negotiated together. They always negotiated through Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law. But with all of this, there has never been a binding legal agreement with the Palestinians. The closest they came was the 1993 Oslo Accords, secretly negotiated under a back channel auspices of Norway and my dear friend Yossi Beilin. And literally, Prime Minister Rabin himself did not know Oslo was happening until it was announced and he agreed to it. In that Oslo Accord, Arafat and the PLO agreed to recognize Israel and Israel to recognize the PLO as the representatives of the Palestinians. But all the tough issues, borders, the fate of the West Bank and Gaza, security arrangements, the status of Jerusalem, and what would happen to the Palestinian refugees were left to late negotiations, and to this day, have never been resolved. There are two radically different narratives by two peoples, each claiming the same small but precious land. I believe firmly that had Prime Minister Rabin not been assassinated in 1995 by a right-wing Israeli fanatic to stop the peace process in its tracks, that there would have been a solution to the Palestinian impasse with an eventual two-state solution. Rabin, who I knew very well, had the unique credibility as a war hero, but with the vision of two peoples living side by side. I remember my late wife, Fran, and I having a dinner with him and Leah, just as the first Intifada broke out in 1987. And I didn't know anything about Intifada. What did it mean? Why were the Palestinians demonstrating so violently? And I asked Rabin his analysis of why this was happening. In his laconic way, in between chain smoking, he said, because they don't like us to occupy them. He had the vision, he had the capability, but he died, and that one bullet changed history. Now, I want to close by suggesting to you how many opportunities the Palestinians have had to accept generous Israeli peace proposals, and then to close with a few thoughts on Gaza. Abi Ibn once said, the Palestinians never lose an opportunity to lose an opportunity. Between 1997 and 2000, I was the Clinton administration's leader for the economic dimension of the peace process. Dennis Ross did the political side. I negotiated half a dozen times with Yasser Arafat. We had gotten Congress to pass a law which allowed any country, in that time it was Egypt, Jordan, and the Palestinian Authority, that had a peace agreement with Israel, to create an industrial zone in which any company in that zone that used as little as 10% Israeli content in their product could ship their products back duty-free to the United States. Now, I want to take you to July 2000. I'm in Gaza as Deputy Secretary of the Treasury and as the Chief Economic Negotiator. And what I saw was beautiful, and I use that word. It was beautiful. There were 30 plants in this industrial zone, not Israeli plants, American plants, European plants, Japanese plants, Singaporean plants, all making products with a little content from Israel, employing 1,200 Gazans. And I was taken to see the foundations being laid for the second 30 plants in the second phase of the industrial park. And I went into one of those plants, and I saw the products being loaded onto a flatbed truck, going through the Eretz crossing to the airport that the Corps of Engineers at our request had built for the Palestinians. There was one unarmed Israeli soldier overseeing this entire operation. July of 2000. By the way, on a more humorous note, during that same visit, I went to Irbid in northern Jordan to see the first of what are now 13 of these industrial zones. Irbid is in northern Jordan in the more fundamentalist area, and I came into a plant that was almost as big as this congregation, with women in their hijabs, in white, stitching and sewing. And the manager said to me, "Mr. Secretary, would you like to see what these women, these fundamentalist women, are making?" And I said, "Of course." And I went over, and they were making lingerie for Victoria's Secret. And I said, "This is the real peace process." Well, that's what could have been. I went from my visit to Gaza and Irbid to see Arafat in Ramallah, in his headquarters. And I was excited to tell him that we had just gotten figures from the World Bank showing that unemployment in the West Bank was now down to 8%, as we had almost 50,000 day workers coming in from the West Bank to Israel. And as we had these industrial plants going in Gaza, the unemployment rate there was down to 14%. But before I could say anything, Arafat said, "Mr. Secretary, I have a message I want you to deliver to President Clinton. I want you to tell him not to invite me to the Camp David II summit he's planning." And I said, "Mr. President, why shouldn't he?" He said, "Because I'm not prepared to make the compromises he needs to make it successful." He was invited, the summit failed, the second intifada started, and things have never quite gotten back on track. It's critical for those students who are demonstrating for Hamas and the faculty members who support them all over the country. And my son Brian and I went to Columbia just before the second night of Passover last year to see the demonstrations there, and to tell them the following. 1947, the UN creates a Jewish state, so named, and an Arab state out of the British Mandate. Israel accepts the partition, the Arabs don't, and go to war. At Camp David, as I mentioned, the Palestinians refused to participate. In the summer of 2000, after my visit to Gaza and my meeting with Arafat, he refused the following offer, called the Clinton parameters. 91% of the West Bank, East Jerusalem as a capital of a new Palestinian state, rejected. 2005, Ariel Sharon, the very person I mentioned, shaking hands in the receiving line with Sadat, a tough general, decides it's time for Israel to leave Gaza. He withdraws every single IDF soldier and then has the soldiers withdraw 7,000 settlers from their homes. I wish we could show the videos to these students of the settlers kicking and screaming about being pulled out of their homes. By the end of 2005, there wasn't one Israeli soldier or civilian in Gaza. Not only that, but Israel left the industrial park that I've talked about. They left the greenhouses. They left Gaza to become, maybe we should call it the Riviera of the Middle East. And instead, Hamas wins the election in 2006, takes power in 2007, and sends rockets instead of roses to Israel. 2009, another prime minister, Ehud Olmert, offers the current president of the Palestinian Authority, Mohammed Abbas, now in his 16th year of a 4-year term, 96% of the West Bank and East Jerusalem as a capital, and 50,000 Palestinian refugees allowed to come back on a permanent basis to be reunited with their families. Rejected. All of this has taken a toll on Israeli public opinion, capped by the October 7, 2023 massacre of Israelis, the worst single-day loss of Jewish lives since the Holocaust, with over 250 taken as hostages. Now, I want to be frank. The Israeli government let its citizens down with several disastrous misjudgments. One was perhaps Israel's worst intelligence failure, told to me by 2 Israeli generals. That is, they said we failed to recognize that Hamas had transformed itself from a terrorist group into a full-blown, full-fledged, well-armed, well-trained terrorist army of 35,000. And yes, they said, we knew that there were some tunnels from Gaza to Egypt. We didn't know there were 150 to 200 miles of tunnels, some as deep as 25-story building. When you add that to the second decision, which was the Prime Minister's decision to weaken an already weak Palestinian Authority, but one committed under the Oslo Accords to peace with Israel and to cooperate with Israel in combating terrorism, in favor of acquiescing in Qatar providing $500 million to Hamas, all to avoid a Palestinian state. And third was ignoring our lessons as the United States made in the Iraq War of 2003 in deposing Saddam Hussein, which is never start fighting until you first have a credible political plan in place of what a post-war government will look like. Now, with a very conservative government, the most conservative in its history, committed to the greater Israel, with a divided Palestinian leadership, with Hamas badly wounded but not exterminated, with West Bank settlers violently acting against the Palestinians in the West Bank, which is the next area where conflagration will occur, and with a dramatic drop in public opinion in Israel supporting a two-state solution. I know that from my own relatives and friends, but it's reinforced by a poll which was just taken last week. Only 27% of Israelis favor a Palestinian state, fearing it will become a radical state. With all of these, the prospect for peace is dimmer than ever. The courageous leaders on the American, Israeli, and Arab sides that I mentioned, responsible for Camp David, for the Jordan Peace Accord, for the Abraham Accords, are nowhere to be found. With the divide between the goals of Israel and those of Hamas, Hamas wanting to stay in power, Israel properly indicating they must not. No country can accept a terrorist government on its borders. The gap is as wide as the Grand Canyon, and no amount of creative American diplomacy, Jimmy Carter, Bill Clinton, Trump, or anyone can bridge this gap immediately. Now, this has been thrown into even greater disarray by President Trump's remarkable promise for the U.S. to take over Gaza, to have 2 million Gazans leave Gaza for presumably Egypt and Israel and Jordan, which can't possibly absorb them, and to construct Gaza into the Riviera of the Middle East. He brings the perspective of a real estate developer. It may, however, have one salutary impact. Perhaps it will force the key Arab countries called the Arab Quint, Egypt, Jordan, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Republics, to come off the sidelines. They've now committed to meet to see if they can come up with their own plan for how Gaza will be governed without Hamas. Serious negotiations have to ensue on the second phase of President Biden's excellent three-stage plan to get the rest of the hostages out. And that calls for a permanent ceasefire, the return of all the hostages, and for the IDF to leave Gaza. That is a dim prospect unless the United States gets directly involved, and it probably will not. I fear that the new Trump plan will throw a monkey wrench into the hostage negotiations and leave Hamas no incentive to release the remaining hostages. Now, I believe firmly that Israel, again, has to be placed in the following perspective. Israel's real security doesn't rest in tiny Gaza. Its real security rests on being embedded into a U.S.-led, moderate Sunni Arab coalition against Iran and its so-called axis of resistance, the proxies who have been so weakened by Israel over the last several months. And this is not a pipe dream. Israel already has a peace agreement with Jordan, with Egypt, with the UAE, with Bahrain, with Morocco. And we were within weeks in the Biden administration. I know for a fact we were within weeks of having the Saudis join the Abraham Accords. And that would be the last piece of the moderate Arab puzzle to come into place. That's Israel's security. Now, I believe if I'm invited here 3 or 4 years from now, indeed if I'm here 3 or 4 years from now, that Saudi Arabia will join that coalition because there's such a mutual fear of Iran. But it will be complicated because the Saudis now have a greater demand than they did before October 7th. Before October 7th, the Saudis wanted only the following from Israel: some vague promise of dealing with the Palestinians in the future. Now they're insisting, because their street is demanding it, a Palestinian state, although the timeline can be in the distant future. And they want a nuclear agreement with the United States and a defense agreement with the United States. That will happen, but it's not going to happen immediately. If President Trump can convince Prime Minister Netanyahu and the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia to have the political courage that has been responsible for the peace agreements that I've outlined before, he will have deserved what is his abiding goal of getting a Nobel Prize. The lessons of Jimmy Carter is to have a president who is willing to take the time, the effort, the courage, the creativity to forge a peace agreement between equally courageous Israeli leaders and Saudi Arabia to convince the Arab states to develop a post-war plan for the governance and security of Gaza, to not just give lip service to the Palestinians, which they've done year after year and decade after decade, and to strengthen and reform the Palestinian Authority. I want to leave you on a positive note, and that positive note is I believe firmly this will happen. It may not happen tomorrow, but we will see Saudi Arabia become part of the Abraham Accords. We will see Israel embedded into a coalition to combat Iran, and that will happen, I believe, in our lifetimes. Shabbat Shalom.